Hi, everybody. Um, Here to talk about color management and virtual production. I am Kris Murray. This talk was originally developed with myself and Vlad Simeon, who is LUX Machina's color scientist. We work for LUX Machina. I don't know if everybody's familiar with us, but we specialize in virtual production, themed entertainment, live entertainment, generally leveraging display technology for creative purposes. This talk is mostly meant to be about the tools that we've developed along the way. There's a lot of problems with working with displays and putting cameras in front of them and having that look copacetic and actually create a beautiful image that people want to see. It's not meant to be the only answer. It is an answer to some of the problems that we face. If you've got ideas about things we should be doing or could be doing that would make the process better, totally interested in talking about it. We're really passionate about this. Yeah, feel free. This is a very brief overview, just sort of simplifying like where we are in the process, or what parts of the process that we touch. We've got source files that go into something called OpenColor.io or OCIO that manages a lot of the transforms and color spaces that we have to manage. There's renderers that we're dealing with via either Unreal, Unity, Pixera, those types of things. There's OCIO that manages leveraging display technology, so going into monitors, going into LEDs, going into lights, which is sort of not necessarily the desired workflow from OCIOs to drive lighting fixtures, but we've been leveraging it to do so. And then we've also got cameras that we have to interact with, and then also compositing for things like AR graphics or simulcam and those types of workflows. We have to manage all of these parts of the chain, or at least help make all of this, hopefully better. And so some of the things that we're battling are time and budget, just like everybody else. It's same situation as normal. We're generally trying to find a balance between speed and accuracy. If you give me an infinite amount of time, I can make everything look as perfect as possible, but that's obviously not conducive to actual production. You want to do it as fast as possible, as best as possible, given the constraints and the desired outcome. Like Sam and others have been saying, this is all still very much the Wild West. We've been going at this for about 10 years, but it's still developing very, 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 very fast. There's still a lot of understanding, and there's a lot of education efforts that are kind of moving forward to try and get everybody on the same page so that we all sort of are working in unison. But it's still a pretty big undertaking. There's a lot of people who have not necessarily worked with these technologies yet. And sort of one of the biggest things that I think we're battling is actually having meaningful conversation early on in the production process where a DP, a cinematographer, a gaffer, people in visual effects, people who are doing virtual production are all talking about like what the deliverables are going to be and how all of these people work together. There's things you need to decide about like what the source materials are going to be delivered in, what type of lights you might be using, what sort of color spaces those lights work in, and how are we going to communicate information from a rendering engine that is going to be put onto a light for image-based lighting. Those are all really important conversations that we want to get out of the way early. And there's another part of this too, which is like look development needs to happen a lot sooner, in my opinion. LUTs that DPs and cinematographers are using, those should be shared. We should be getting those on board with the previs teams, the people who are doing the virtual production teams for their monitoring, so that they can sort of understand what the sort of intended look is going to be. So they're all sort of working together on this. So how do we approach some of these things? And we really start out with some strong foundations. And what I mean by that is we're generally trying to leverage things that are industry standard as much as possible. We don't necessarily want to create all these different forks of weird proprietary stuff. Like, we're trying to be very collaborative with everybody. And sort of the first part of this is we're leveraging ASUS and all the great work that the Academy's been doing with that. The reason why we're choosing something like ACCG as the basis for like our working color space and how we're managing assets and all this stuff is we know that it's going to cover pretty much every type of display technology that we are going to try and leverage, at least right now. It also will cover the working gamut of what many of the lights will actually produce. Many of the lighting fixtures that do exist produce saturated colors way outside of things like sRGB or even P3 in many of these fixtures. And we think it's important to be able to continue to leverage all of the capabilities of the light or the display. Like we want to use as much of it as possible. And so we really want to start with a wide gamut. It's also pretty well accepted in the visual effects industry, and for the near term, we're still going to be dealing with a lot of visual effects they're producing a lot of these environments. They're stitching a lot of the really high resolution plates. So like we want to work within the confines of what's easy for them, what's easy for us, and what's best for production. But there's a lot of things that today that we still have to handhold and change. Even with something as advanced as Unreal Engine, it's not necessarily ready to leverage something like ACCG, or it wasn't, as its working color space. There was a lot of modifications we had to do to make that work. Unreal 5.1, 5.2, that's got a little bit better. 5.3, definitely a lot better. We're hoping by 5.4, we're going to peel back most of our work. But things that we needed to do was modify how color, temperature, and tint work within Unreal Engine. There was many different algorithms that existed in many different places that weren't exactly accurate, and when used together, produced results that are not ideal. And color temperature, having accurate control of color temperature, as I'm sure everybody here knows, is very important. And so there was a lot of places that we needed to handle a lot of that. And there was also some pretty broad assumptions about sRGB in things like media frameworks for handling things like SDI input. There was an expectation of sRGB or Rec 709, which obviously just doesn't work for some of our production workflows, where in our case, we actually can handle the camera log encodings for almost every manufacturer, all of the big four that you guys are going to be dealing with. We also leverage things like Pixera. We were basically the driving force behind them leveraging OCIO and incorporating that into their product. We spent about 6 months working on that with them and validating that and basically getting them off the ground. We also use them because they give us the ability to write shaders so that we can make color correction tools or color grading tools that can be put in a language that makes sense for people that are working on a film set. So having something like the ASE CDL for lift gamma gain controls, like those are important. Having things adjusted in stops for exposure, that's important. And so like we can provide those controls on top of Pixera. Like those things don't exist in it by itself. And many of like the pre-rendered playback software just doesn't have that type of stuff. And so it allows us to leverage our skills, being able to write shaders and code and stuff like that to make a better experience, I think, for everybody who's on a film set. And so just going to go back to this again for a second. So we sort of walked through some of this, basically just past the render. I'm going to start talking about some of like how we're mapping to some of the display technologies, and we'll start off with some of our monitoring strategies, because one thing that's actually really important is you have people that are controlling the volumes similar to here, right? You've got a brain bar situation somewhere where people are not necessarily in the volume, they're not necessarily line of sight. The lighting setups, there's floppies everywhere. It's difficult to see what's actually happening on these screens, and we want the operators to be able to see and feel confident of what they are going to, or what they're looking at on their local monitors. Or you get a cinematographer, DP, or whoever, some type of creative who's coming up and they're like, they want to point to something on a monitor and say that needs to go away, or that needs to be more red or less red, or it's needs to be down a third of a stop or something like that. We want to be able to make creative choices if you're standing over somebody's shoulder and looking at a monitor. And so we have effectively two modes of working for our operators. One where we basically scale the local display to map exactly the range of what's capable on the LED product, so that we know that if something's clipping off the top of the local monitor, that it's clipping on the LED. And then we also have another mode where the exact values are mapped to the capabilities of the local display, so that if somebody wants to come up and look at something and get a feel of what it's going to look like, they can do that. We generally want to shy away from things like providing S-curves and tone mapping to provide, accuracy in the highlights in the low end, just because it raises too many questions, at least in our experience, with what people are seeing on a monitor and why does it look different than what they're seeing on the volume. We don't necessarily want those things to separate too far. With that, the big chunk, I think, of like what we've been doing at Lux is trying to leverage displays for in-camera use, and that's with projection, with LED, but it definitely brings like a pretty big question of how do we calibrate these things, or how do we make these things look right? And even today, we still hear just lots of war stories about people who showed up on set, everything looks way too saturated, everything looks way too contrasted, or way too something, right? Or not enough of something. And people are still fighting this, every single day. And I think we want to talk about these things so that people know that there are things to do and things that they can be doing, or at least motion to their existence, so that people can start to figure out how to implement some of them. So. This is a very rude diagram of what our sort of start of our color calibration process was. And this is largely based off of Rod Bogart's work, the paper he published in 2021 after some work that we had done with him for a volume that we stood up together. But basically what we do is we subject a camera and a display to some test patterns. We get that footage off of the camera. That goes into Nuke, similar to a visual effects pipeline. We've written some custom Python that strips apart parts of the image, creates a LUT. It goes into another Python script, which infers what's happening and creates a calibration matrix that we then can apply via OCIO to make these things work well together, so that we can actually get a display that is producing linear light through a camera and is in the correct color space, and so that they're aligned. I'll give some visual representation of what I mean by that in a little bit later if that doesn't make sense to you. But some of the things that we found, especially with doing some of our early tests, and this is basically the test that's outlined by Rod. He shows a CMS pattern that's generated by a piece of visual effects software that you would capture with the camera, and that you would get some understanding of the whole color volume as it exists. The challenge with doing that is things like vignette exists on lenses, and we need to do some work to undo that. And so we basically have created some math that allows us to linearize allows us to remove the vignette so that the data that's produced is accurate to what we would have visually seen without a lens. There's still some difficulty with this, so we sort of moved past this, but this does provide a really fast way for us to calibrate a camera. We only need 2 frames for this approach. The challenge with this approach is things like bloom or other sort of chromatic aberrations that allow samples to bleed into each other is not ideal. And so we came up with another method where we basically take a sequence of all of these patches and we run them through their paces, and what we get out of this very quickly, in a few seconds, is some mapping of the entire color volume. And once we sort of get all of that information, we can put it into something called a LUT viewer. And think about this as like a 3-dimensional vector scope. This allows us to see all of the samples that we would have and how they exist in relation to the color gamut. And so some of the issues that we have with working, well, sorry, let me start. We can see here that there's like some targets, which are like the outside of a cube, and then we have a bunch of patches that are in the middle, and they're sort of not necessarily, they're acting kind of linear, but they're all skewing off in a weird direction. This is what I would consider not calibrated or uncalibrated. The display is a great display. It's producing linear light. We're not worried about that, but this is not necessarily calibrated. The images that are going to come through this are going to be skewed. They're going to look, sorry, let me see what this is. It's going to look too magenta, and you're not going to be happy about that. You're going to be fiddling with a bunch of color grading tools to try and take that out, but then you're going to end up with a bunch of non-linearities in the image, and you don't want that. And so what we do is we basically compute a matrix by gathering some of the samples inside of this color volume, and then we do a correction on that so that the actual samples are now linear. And so if you look at the one on the left, all of this is actually, like, it looks very cubic. The points are evenly spaced between each other, and they all are moving in flat lines. This is what I would consider something that's calibrated, and we can get, a really good image out of something like this. Like, we can know from an operator standpoint, if they see something that looks like that, that we're going to be good for the shoot. And over here on the right, this is showing the samples that we actually pull out from the middle of this to do our 3x3 matrix based on. The reason why we pick a section in the middle is we want to avoid clipping of the camera, clipping of the LED wall or the display, the projector, whatever it is. And there's also a problem in this particular color space that we're working in is ACCG, some of the full the full primaries are imaginary colors. Like, they're not reproducible, period. And so what this allows us to do is sample from somewhere safe, we extrapolate the rest of the volume, and then we can produce an image that is really well balanced and corrected for camera. And so another thing that we've gone and done, because we do think that the lenses that are being selected for these productions, in many cases actually provide some type of creative intent. Like, they do provide some type of filtration, for a lack of a better word, that provides some type of creative input on the final image. And what we've been seeing with a lot of, like, the closed loop calibration cycles that people have been doing is they're actually removing that when they're testing or when they're calibrating through a lens. What you end up doing is removing the characteristics that the lens would be putting on that image, and now you have a background and a foreground that no longer match, because there's no way for us to color correct that foreground to make those things happen exactly the same. So for us, what we've created is effectively a pinhole lens that has a mechanical diaphragm. This is just 3D printed components and stuff. We do this very cheaply. But what this allows us to do is control the blur or the focus, because one problem with pinhole lenses is you basically have infinite depth of field, and infinite depth of field means a hell of a lot of moire, and you don't want that. And so what we can do is open that up just enough to get as much blur as we want without necessarily having the light bounce around within everywhere inside the camera body, and still produce a result that, when paired back together with the final image, looks more put together, in my opinion. And these effects are subtle, but I do think it matters. And so you'll see here that there's some patches like you've seen in the previous setup, but there's like some that have a black border and some that have a white border. And that's the difference of shooting with a particular lens. And this is actually a new lens. This is a newer Zeiss. Optical clarity, really good on that. But if you're shooting on something that's old Panavision glass or something like that, there's going to be a bigger disparity between those things. But like that, in my opinion, is enough disparity for anyone in this room to see. Yeah, so as we've been going through a lot of this process up to this point, right, we started determining that really there was a massive problem that we needed to deal with. And earlier on, when we showed the sort of production process for us, there was a part that we said footage, and we really glossed over something. And the reality is, like, the footage, in many cases, that step could take hours or days, because it's camera crews offloading the footage. It's going to get to editorial, and then needs to get approved by somebody to send to us. We've got to download it, or we've got to upload it to somebody if they've got to work remote. And in many cases, that is a massive problem for us. And so what we ended up doing was said, okay, screw it. Let's get rid of Nuke, which is a really expensive portion of this process. Let's get rid of the footage that needs to get handled and offloaded and sent somewhere. It's also tons of data, which also adds its own delays to processing. And we said, let's do this all inside of a render engine that can happen super quickly. And so what you'll see here is on the left, we've got a camera feed that is coming from the camera via SDI into our render engine. In this case, it's Unreal. We're subjecting the camera to a bunch of patches. That was the entirety of our test. We're going to send this to a 3D viewer, which we'll see here in a sec. And so this will pop up. We'll see that this is the uncalibrated image. We say, OK, that's great. We're going to run the test again after we've calibrated or created the correction matrix, which we then apply to the material. It moves to this again, and then we'll see another version of this once it's done, which it's done. And so that's our verification pass. And then we'll set up another viewer, and we'll look at the corrected image. Sorry, I guess I talk faster than I operate. But now we've got a corrected image, and like we're ready to go at that point. And so what used to take us 4 hours to a day of turnaround, we can now do in minutes. Like this is actual real time. This is not sped up. This is what we can now do on a production. And so like this is a pretty huge deal for us, in my opinion. And anybody can do this with a little bit of like time and effort, or call us. But we also take the same approach, and we can actually calibrate lights. And so we've got a perfect reflector here. We've got a cream source in this particular case, but we've done this with many, many lights. Perfect reflector, run it through the camera, and we could basically align the color space or the gamut of the fixture to the camera in the same amount of time for us to calibrate display technology or anything like that, and have our image-based lighting work with whatever the native gamut of the tile is at whatever it's capable of producing. And so if we've got some really high fidelity content that's in a wide color gamut, and we've got a light that's got a wide color gamut for display, we can actually make those things work well together and quickly. There are some caveats with the lighting workflow, just because many of the fixtures that exist today are, they're multispectral. They are 5 primaries, 7 primaries, 9 primaries, and it's not really easy for us to map those things today in things like Pixera or Unreal or any other technology. Like this is a problem that we all need to work on, especially in the lighting side of the industry, and standardizing how we kind of move these things together. So in this case, we are leveraging the RGB data that we're mapping directly to a fixture, or we're using the ESTA 154 for color communication, or we're using XY data, for the ProPhoto or Kodak ProPhoto RGB, or we're using XY data directly. We also need to profile the EOTF, for lack of a better word, of the fixture. Like we need to know the encoding curve of the fixture, because they're going to have some type of exponential encoding or log encoding or some type of S-curve, and we need to know what that is in order to accurately map. Right now we're working on automating this process to make it just as fast as what we're doing on and mapping the color gamut. We basically will ramp through a series of grayscales, and we'll produce a 1D LUT that get applied to the fixture, so that we don't have to have a conversation with Kino or Ari or whoever about, hey, we'll sign an NDA, can you please tell us the encoding curve of your fixture? We don't necessarily have to do that. I would love for them to just publish that information, because I do think that's important for people that are moving into this realm into the future. But until then, we're going to make a brute force method of this. We have it now, it's not automated, it's manual. And a big sort of thing that I think everybody should know as they move into these sort of collaborative workflows is that we need to make sure that we're maintaining control for the lighting operators when we're working in image-based lighting. Like we need to merge the data. They need to have final control. This can't be we're doing switches and stuff. and there's plenty of product out there that exists that can merge streaming ACN data, DMX, ArtNet, all that. Like, it's all doable. We just need to make sure that when we're building and planning these systems that we have a conversation going about how they're going to maintain control, because getting image-based lighting is not the only solution, and it's definitely not going to be the only one that they need on any given day, and they're going to need to be able to move fast and faster than we can. And also remember that the lighting control can go the opposite direction into the digital world, where things like digital light cards and all that stuff, it's really easy to give control for some of those things. We spend a lot of our time on the front end of productions building a lot of that infrastructure so that we can be hands-off in many ways, and they can put light cards, black cards, any of that up, and in meaningful terms, so it's not a bunch of weird computer stuff. It's, things like exposure and stops, and meaningful communication. Like, that's all doable. So what's next for us? We obviously want to keep improving the lighting integration with our closed loop calibration tool. Keep improving our visualization tools. It's a really good confidence builder for our operational teams and people that are on set, because you can look at something, you can look at it in this 3D view and have a good understanding really quickly about whether or not something is or isn't calibrated without actually having to pull footage off the camera and have DIT or somebody scour through it. Just nobody has time for that stuff. So we want to provide a really easy, flexible tool and keep expanding on that. We wanted to do a lot of automation of data for lighting fixtures, for display technology, so that people can come to us and basically have these things profiled quickly, and maybe at some point in the future we would just have some type of open database for that. And then the next thing is a lot of these processes that we have are spectral in nature. The camera response is spectral. The light that comes off the LEDs or the light that comes off these lighting fixtures, it's all spectral. I want to get to the point that we don't actually need to present a camera and a product together to compute the matrices to make those things correct. I think we can do that purely with spectral information, which I think will be better for everybody. But yeah, thank you. I don't know, is there any questions?
Questions? Anyway, hang on. Run your mic.
So when you're looking at that 3D matrix of color, what are the X, Y, and Z axes that you're looking at? What's the benefit of examining in 3 dimensions, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so in that diagram, it is the ACCG color space. That's like our working color space. That's what we're working in. It could be anything. Like, that could be Rec 709 or sRGB, and the color samples would be in a different position. But basically what we're looking at is the color volume of our R, G, and B, where red is on one axis, green is on another, and blue is on another. And so when you have a white, it's up in the corner. When you have red, it's going to be all the way, in that specific one, it's going to be all the way to the left. Green is all the way to the right. Blue's going up. And so any one of those patches or points is basically just saying it had this amount of green, this amount of blue, and this amount of red. And it just allows us to kind of, similar, like so vector scope is effectively the same thing, but looking at it down the neutral axis, but it's just flat, and you don't see any luminosity. And so this way we basically get levels and the vector scope in one view, and it allows us to kind of get a better understanding, in my opinion, of what we're looking at, because we can fly around it. Like, we can zoom in, we can see, where are we clipping, where are we not, and I think it's a pretty big tool, in my opinion, for exploring, how the technologies are working together.
If a DIT wants to understand a little bit more about what is going through in the calibration process, especially for the camera itself, having multiple cameras, for example, you might on a given project have 3 different types of even a red between all of them, different gamuts, color sciences. What should they understand? Just because typically, Nuke is a fantastic program. A lot of amazing LUTs come out of that program. Yep. Is there a way where we can understand or learn a little bit more about that calibration process that you're doing and implement that as a function of what we do for the cinematographer and thus for the gaffer?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing this today actively in production. This is like, if you call us, happy to help. The algorithm or portions of the algorithm, or at least the the approach that we're taking is a public paper. If you find me and we exchange contact info, I can send you Rod Bogart's paper from Epic Games that he published in 2021, so you can at least see some of the math behind it. Ours is a little bit different because we're dealing with some slightly different stuff, or we're just moving beyond some of that. But yeah, happy to talk about any of that. Find me. There's not enough people talking to me about this stuff. I would literally talk for hours. If you want to talk, I'm down to talk. But then getting back to your multi-camera production setup, one thing to know is, like earlier we're looking at frustums and stuff like that. We can only correct for one camera at a time, right? So like if you're trying to have two different cameras, like a Red and a Sony, those things are going to see that information differently. So unless those things are actually crossing and their frustums don't overlap, we can't do something about that. But if they don't overlap, then we can do something about that. Or we'd have to change on a per take basis of, whether we're corrected for the Red or whether we're corrected for the Sony. But that's all doable. It's a juggle that we all need to talk about as, hey, this is the goal we're trying to do, and we just all would come up with a game plan for that. There's just going to be limitations and some caveats to it, but it's totally doable.
We have a question from Zoom here. Will your closed loop calibration add-on be available in Unreal? You're going to make that publicly available?
Yeah, we are hoping to do so. The challenge right now is we have to run a modified version of Unreal, so it's like the entire engine is different. So we can't release that as a plugin today, because if you put that into some other version of Unreal, it wouldn't work, because we have to change so much of the Media I/O frameworks. But we're working with Epic Games to try and share some of our knowledge of what we need it to do, so that 4.5.3 or for 4.5.4, it will have enough of this that this could move into a plugin that we could potentially provide to the market or the marketplace for people to leverage. But it's definitely something that we're interested in. We want this to work. There's also tools out there called OpenVPCal, which was a product of Netflix, and it's in the open source domain that people are working on that are providing similar functionality to what we're doing, but it is a little bit different, and maybe those things at some point in the future kind of mash together. But yeah, I mean, we definitely want this out in the world. That's why I'm talking about it today. Is these things need to be doing? We all need to be doing these things on production in order to be successful, in my opinion. And the more people that know about them, the better.
Maybe you can speak to sort of your vision of the future, like from a DP's perspective. If I'm working on set and I have an LED wall that I'm doing potentially real-time color correction, I'm doing lighting where I'm changing the colors, I have a camera, I'm doing live color grading with a DIT. It ends up being a lot of different people to try to, accomplish, one task. And how do you see that kind of coalescing into a better communication and just better strategies to achieve the look?
Yeah, so my opinion is we should be doing more of these calibration processes instead of doing this via grading, because I think the problem with doing the grading is that you create a lot of non-linearities, and then you've got people that it's like Bambi on ice situation where somebody touches one thing and now you got to go touch something else, which I think is what you're describing. And I think the challenge with that is that we're not necessarily starting from the right baseline. And so if we handle these calibration processes where everything ends up in the right space, then everything's minute adjustments on top of things that are all balanced together. And then it's about the creative that we're trying to input onto the environment or onto the scene to make it look like how we want, without it necessarily needing to be like massive swings of putting resolve in line and stuff like that, so that you can have tools you're familiar with. I think right now we're doing that because it's a thing to do. In my opinion, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. I think the grading, honestly, is something that should happen after the camera acquisition. That's something we should be doing on the back end. On the front end, we should be basically making these things linear, like it should be acting like the real world in many ways. And the creative tools that we're providing for things like lift, gamut, gain, contrast, saturation, and stuff like that, in my opinion, should be for minute adjustment. Or we're trying to creatively transform a plate. Like we've got a plate that was shot in the day and we want it to look like sunset. That's, those grading tools, that starts to make a whole lot of sense. But I think if the basis is we're putting resolve in line in order to make things look right, I think we're starting at the right point, or the wrong point for that, in my opinion.
I was just wondering, I've kind of been in and out of this on my, what you're describing with color calibration, is that going to be per tile, or like, because I've used probably 4 different tiles here in the last year. And so is your calibration going to be kind of a blanket thing, or is it going to be tile by tile, system by system kind of a?
Yeah, the why we made it work really quickly is it's by camera and tile. So having a camera and a tile and different tile, like if you got 4 different tiles on set, that's 4 different calibrations we got to build. And so it was a big deal for us when this was all happening in Nuke, and we're processing, you know, terabytes of footage and stuff like that, and it's getting sent from England to LA or LA to England. Those are huge deals, and so we wanted to make it work very quickly inside a render engine off of STI, so that basically press button, within a minute we've got the calibration and we're done. But yeah, right now, just with how all these things work together, you're doing that per tile and per camera. Or per light and per camera, just because like there is a spectral process that's happening where there's a conversion that the camera is doing because it needs to get to a red, green, and a blue value. And so how that looks to the light or how that looks to the tile is, they're going to get different stuff, and so we've got to solve those things independently. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much.